Hello, all. Welcome to another session of Legal Essentials for Human Resource Management. Now, this is week 8 and session 40, which means that this is our final session of the course. If you have come this far, thank you so much for continuing to watch each and every session, and thank you so much for investing your time to build a legal acumen in the area of employment as well as industrial relations. Now, quite poetic it is. The final title of this entire course is Termination of Employment and Full and Final Settlement. So, if you look at the discussions we had till now, in this particular week, we were looking at misconduct and how you can do a domestic inquiry on a misconduct, and we are looking at that there could be some possible punitive actions that would be taken by the employer, and one of the very obvious punitive action taken by the employer is termination of the employment. So we look into that aspect also, and otherwise also termination happens because you got a better job, or you don't want to continue in the job and you want to have some time for yourself, and so you want to terminate the employment. You want to do a higher studies, so you want to terminate the employment. So could be any of those reasons, not just misconduct. We in entirety we look at what is this concept of termination of employment and what do we mean by the concept of full and final settlement. So without much delay, let's get into the session. Let's have a discussion on this topic. And for one last time, my name is Dr. Amish Samalopanan and I am from Nalsa University of Law. Now, what is this full and final settlement, often known as F&F in the HR circle? Now, an employment is going to end. A termination of employment contract is going to happen. Of course, last month wage has to be given. We said that there would be some components of gratuity involved if they have served more than 4.5 years. And that gratuity time period has been changed in the newly proposed labor codes. So whichever it is, there's going to be a gratuity amount that need to be paid. If the person have reached the age of superannuation, have reached the age of retirement, he has to be given his a provident fund amount. So papers regarding that has to be taken. So there's a lot of things that has to be done when a termination of employment happens. So this process of calculating the entire payable dues when an employee is resigning, retired, or terminated from the organization is called as full and final settlement. So make no mistake, full and final settlement is not just for a termination by the employer side. It can also be a retirement where happily an employee have continued for a maximum allocatable years of service and then he is retiring. Or it could also be because the employee wanted to terminate it and then he is resigning from the employment. Could be that too. And while calculating the F&F, there could be paying, of course, because there would be pending wages, leave and encashments, gratuity amounts. It can also be recovering. Sometimes there would be some damages that has been made. There would be some fines that has to be collected. So it is both a recovering as well as a paying exercise. Now, what does the labor code says? So the proposed labor code says that a company must pay the complete salary settlement within 2 days after the employee has completed their last working day. backing there, let it be dismissal, resignation, or termination. Now that's what the proposed labor code says. Existing law is that if you are terminating, you have to settle within 2 days. But ideally, it can be around 30 days. So law is kind of silent here. Wage has to be paid at the end of the by the end of the next month, 10th. So if you have remember our discussions regarding wage, it either has to be paid by the 7th day of the next month or 10th day of the next month if you are a bigger organization. So same principle applicable here. So within the next 7th or 10th day is a general rule in conducting FNF. But termination, it has to be done within 2 days. Within labor code also, the proposed labor code also says this process has to be completed within 2 days. But how it will happen, what are the possible challenges and all, we'll only know once it is implemented and then we actually put those things into practice. And often it is the HR unit that is in charge of handling this process. And as I told, often it takes a month. So how it often happens is that either a termination is raised, and then the employer gets into this process of FNF, or an employee puts down his papers by which he puts down his resignation, and then the employer asks him to serve a particular notice period, and during the notice period at the back end FNF calculations happen, and then by the stipulated time, which I said is next month 7th or 10th, FNF is done. So it often happens in multiple stages. So the first stage, of course, is serving the notice period. So you put in a resignation, then you go into for a notice period. So the whole idea of notice period is that, see, you were doing a critical function at your workplace. So now you are going, so obviously somebody have to step into your shoes. So the employer can ask you to stay back until he wants to, he needs you. But there is, of course, upper limit. He can't put you in an indefinite notice period. Often the industry standards is 1 to 3 months and not more than 3 months. So up to 3 months, the employer can ask you to stay back. Often it is determined by what is written in your employment contract. Sometimes in your employment contract, it is written that both the employer and employee has to maintain 1 month notice period in each. If employer want to terminate the contract or employee want to terminate the contract, both have to serve 1 month notice period. Or it might say that if employer want to terminate, employer will take 1 month notice period, but employee might take 3 months. Anything is possible. But to be very honest, if the employee wants to terminate the service, so the request came from the employee, then the employer, if he wants, he can terminate in the next day also. Let's be very honest. It's just that after termination, within this stipulated time that we are discussing, full and final has to be completed. So if an employer raises a request for termination, and then he cannot argue, okay, I want 1 more month. But if the employer have raised this request, the employer said to an employee that you need to resign, then you have to give notice period to the employee, because employee need to find a new job also, because he might be the sole breadwinner, so he need to identify a new job, so that he needs time. But if the employee raises a resignation letter and submits a resignation letter, employer, if he wants, he can terminate in the next day also. But if he wants, he can ask for a notice period also, depending upon what is written in the employment contract. Now during this process, once within the notice period, once this transfer of responsibility has actually happened, the employee will be asked to hand over all the company assets also. There could be laptops given by the company, there could be mobile phones given by the company, even houses or car would be given by the employer to the employee. So and they came to the employee being an employee of the particular employer. So the employee has to give back everything that has been provided to him. In case if he is not able to submit back, employer has the right to deduct the amount of damage according to his assessment from the FNF, full and final settlement amount. And once employee submits all this back, ensure that you also get a no dues certificate or a no dues slip, whatever it is in writing, because later it should not be a case that the employer gets ground to raise an argument that there is few more a few more valuables which the employee has to submit back to the employer. So best thing would be that you take an initiative and get a no due from your employer. Now let's say if the employee is terminated, it was never the employee who wanted to leave the work, employee was terminated by the employer. So entire process has to be completed within 2 days. Though see, the law is a little clumsy over here. So how many days he has been in the work, unpaid days of salary has to be computed, and then equated it with the 1 month salary. Like let's say he used to get a salary of 60,000. So we have discussed this calculation before. Now the 60,000 is given for 26 days of work. So 60 divided by 26 into number of days he have worked becomes the amount that has to be given to this person, and that has to be given to the terminated employee. And let's say the employee is retired, so additional components of provident fund is and all those would come along with the full and final settlement. Now let's look into the components of full and final settlement one by one. So first is of course the unpaid salary. Often what happens is that the law asks you to pay the salary of a preceding month within the next month 7th or 10th. But often employees have seen this in real, though it's a little in violation of existing law. They might say that okay, you're working for next 45 days, we will do an FNF after the 45 days. So next month's salary we will be giving after 10-15 days more, given that we have to complete the entire process. So however day is been remaining for the person, unpaid days, so you calculate that, and I'm not saying unpaid days would be exactly 1 month salary. It could be sometimes lesser, it could be sometimes more also. So that's what the example I was giving you. Employer said that we will complete it, so this 40 days in total which is unpaid. So you take that and then you add any remaining arrears in terms of a payment that would not made with a scale change, or leave travel allowances. You add all those, and then that becomes the unpaid salary to this particular employee. So that's one component you have to calculate, and that's the obvious component that has to be given. Now there would be non-availed leaves. So there would be leave exchange, and then the money being given in exchange of it. So employee can encash his non-availed leave, and then there was some money involved. So that also becomes a part of your FNF. Any bonuses or special credit offered should also be encashed and added to the full and final settlement. You can't just say that the bonus for the last year will not be given to this person because he decided to leave. No, the bonus was for last year, profit you have made, for which the employee was part of. So in that way, bonus is also calculated into FNF. And the regulation mandates that when an employee resigns, all dues from an employee's unpaid leaves must be paid on or before 7th and 10th of the following month. So same principle. So all the dues has to be done within the next month, 7th or 10th. There could also be gratuity amount. So if you remember our discussions on payment of gratuity, it's given as a social security provision and for employees who had a continued service with the organization. Existing act tells us that a minimum of 5 years, which can also be 4.5 months, which equates to 4 years for 240 days with the company, then you will be paid gratuity amount also. So the gratuity amount has to be paid within 30 days, but often you will see that the entire computation happens inside, because nobody want to pay separately. So, and now it's very much automated, so you get to have all the numbers with a click of the mouse. So the gratuity calculation, if you remember the equation, you take uh, per day salary. So per day salary is calculated as in last drawn salary divided by 26 working days, and then you calculate a half month salary. Now half month salary is by multiplying it into 15 days. So you will get a number, an amount. That amount multiplied by the years of service. So imagine this guy was working for 10 years. This amount into 10 is the gratuity amount that has to be paid. There could also be deductions that the employer has to make. For example, income tax deductions happens at the employer side. Provident fund deductions happen at the employer side. Professional taxes for certain kind of occupation happens at the employer side. Or sometimes what happens, the employee has to immediately join the other company, and for that the employee says that I cannot serve the notice period. And often in the employment contract it would be written that if the notice period is not served, the employee must have to pay a compensation for him to get FNF and as well as experience certificate and all. So that compensation amount will also be deducted in case the employee is not serving the notice period, or the employee is serving a reduced notice period. So that also you will reduce. Now, gratuity, there is no TDS, but then rest amount, there is a TDS calculation. Income tax is based upon the bracket in which you are earning your salary. It could be 30%, 20%, 10%, or no income tax also. Depends upon what is your annual income. So such deductions will also happen in FNF. Now let's imagine this person have completed his entire duration of service age, and he is retiring. So then there is a pension involved. Now the minimum years of pensionable service with your organization is 10 years. So who have completed minimum of 10 years of pensionable service is also eligible for pensions. So depends upon a national pension scheme or whichever it is, contributory pension schemes or the government paid schemes, irrespective of, whichever scheme it is, on the base of that the calculation has been made. And the pensionable service also depends upon the scheme you belong to, and then that amount also has to be calculated and the papers has to be moved for it. Uh, Leave encashment, of course. So that also, unpaid leave can also be cleared, and all the dues should be done within the 7th and 10th of the following month. Now, a biggest question that has been always asked is that if I'm terminating my employee, do I still need to pay and do all FNF? I can just ask him that you've done a misconduct, so I'm not giving you anything, just leave my place. I mean, can you say like that? The truth is that no. Even if you have conducted a proper domestic inquiry that fits into all the compliance mechanisms, there is a show cause notice that has been given, a domestic inquiry that ensures natural justice of the person against whom the complaint is made. Everything is ensured, and then you have identified that he have conducted a misconduct worthy of termination, and then you terminate him also. You can't just shoo him away. Okay, so there are still a lot of components within FNF that you have to pay to this terminated employee. When it comes to salary, the entire salary until the day he have worked, if he is terminated with immediate effect and the order is issued today, which only 2 days passed, 2 days in the present month, for those 2 days wage or salary has to be given. Now, what about leave encashment? Leave encashment is based on the Shops and Establishment Act provisions of each state. So there's no one way to put it. So the best way to say it is that it is based on the contractual provisions and company policies. If your company policy says that if you are terminated for misconduct, you'll not be getting any leave encashment, so then there is no scope for it. But if it is generally silent, then there is a case for leave encashment also. Now, what happens to Provident Fund? Now, at the time a member of scheme leaves the service, the employer is required to forward a duly filled and attested form to the Judicial Provident Fund Commissioner. So, it's Form 19 has to be given to the Provident Fund Commissioner, and a copy of this form has to be given to the terminated employee also, which he will fill, and he will filled by him and then submit to the Jurisdictional Provident Fund Commissioner. So that process the HR has to do if you have terminated the services of the employee. What happens to gratuity amount? So the Payment of Gratuity Act, as you remember, is a gratitude or a reward for a excellent continuous service. Even though that excellent isn't that bold excellence, but still it's a gratitude for a continuous service. There you might imagine that termination can have an impact, which is kind of true also. So if the termination of the employment agreement or dismissal of service is resultant of acts, willful omissions or negligence by the employee and have caused substantial damage to the company, the entitlement of gratuity is liable to be forfeited to the extent of the damages or losses caused to the company. So then the employer can say that due to your misconduct, whichever activity you have done, whatever omission you have done, due to which we as an organization, me as an employer, have faced a loss of this much, and then I will deduct that much amount from your gratuity amount, and remaining only I will give. But the catch here is that employer should have a strong case proving that my extent of damage or loss caused to the company is equivalent to this amount. So you can't just write any ballooned amount and then save some money by not paying gratuity. So if you're arguing that we have a damage of this much amount, you should also have a proof which will tell that this much amount of damage, financial damage, has happened to the employer. In case the employee goes to seeks a judicial intervention and goes to the court, and court will definitely ask the employer to produce a proof which will say that this much amount of damage has happened to the company, to the employer, due to this particular employee. And if the employer is not able to produce the proof which equates that this much amount of damage has happened to us, then the court will intervene and might forfeit the claim of the employer and ask the employer to pay the full gratuity amount. That can happen. So, with that, uh, let me conclude today's session. Often in the last page, you would see what are we going to discuss in the next session, but obviously, this is our last session. So, the course ends here. I would love to wholeheartedly thank every single person who have continued with me throughout this journey. I hope now you have a fair understanding of various legal principles, various compliance based concepts that you should be aware of while dealing with human resources at workplace. I hope this knowledge will make you a more legally aware, socially committed man managers, and I hope you will become a critical component in our dream to build dignified workplaces. Once again, thank you so much. And for one last time, I hope you have a great day ahead. Thank you so much.